The treasures of China and Southeast Asia are beyond anything young Marco Polo could have imagined. Ivory palaces, decorated with gold, silver, and jewels. Huge, sprawling fortresses that dwarf anything in Europe. Wealth beyond his wildest dreams. Yet this strange new land is also rife with danger. Murderous wild beasts, cannibals, pirates, and bandits roam the uncharted wilderness in search of prey. And yet none of these apex predators are quite as dangerous as the Mongol warriors with whom Marco Polo now finds himself. They are ferocious in battle as he has seen many times. Yet to some of these Mongol generals, there's a very thin line between friend and enemy. The rewards are great, the stakes high, the danger very real. It will take cunning, wit, bravery, and a little bit of luck if Marco Polo wishes to survive to tell the tale of his adventure. Hello and welcome back to Badass of the Week. My name is Ben Thompson. I'm here with my co-host, Dr. Pat Larash. And Pat, we are here to do part 2 of Marco Polo, and just kind of wanted to see if maybe we can get started by recapping kind of where we're at the end of part 1.
Yeah, so we're calling this episode part 2 of Marco Polo, but maybe it would be better to call last week's episode like the prequel.
It's true. We didn't actually talk about Marco very much in part 1, did we?
No, I mean, we spent time on his dad and his uncle, and okay, that's cool because they had adventures in their own right and they're badass in their own right. And it's also setting up the scene for what's going to happen in today's episode. And it's going to sound kind of cliched and kind of tropey, but like this is the thing that happens in, young adult fantasy novels. You've got this protagonist, this young protagonist whose parents are absent for whatever reason. And okay, Marco Polo's dad was not around for much of his formative years. And then all of a sudden something happens. It's kind of like a cliche for fiction writing. A stranger comes to town. Who's the stranger? Well, it's this guy and his brother who show up in Venice, on the docks of Venice.
It's your long lost dad here for it, I think. But I don't even know if this counts as being tropey because it predates Luke Skywalker and Harry Potter and all of that. Maybe,
okay,
they all got their ideas from Marco Polo.
Quite possibly. Yeah. I mean, you could argue that there's some of this in the Odyssey, sort of, variation on it or whatever. But
so you just out nerded me.
Oh no. But the truth of the matter is, given the realities of travel, the realities of merchant routes, you can't just hop on a plane and be somewhere, at most 24 hours later. You're schlepping along on, I don't know, in a caravan, boom to boom to boom to boom, and what happens while you're gone? Well, I don't know. Your kids grow up.
Yeah. And it's it's the time period where it's not that weird that you didn't see the guy for 15 years, right?
Yeah.
You assume he's dead, but you're not sure.
Yeah, dead or maybe kind of started a new life elsewhere. But as it turns out, we're in Venice, which, is cool in its own right. But if you're a teenager, you might feel like you're stuck there. And Marco Polo's here. He's in Venice. Boat comes in. These guys get off the boat. Something about that one guy. What is it? His face? Is he a doppelganger or something? Marco, I am your father. Except in a non-evil way, I guess.
Like Gandalf and Darth Vader together? I
Sure,
don't know.
Why not? Yeah. Young Marco Polo, who's kind of full of energy and looking for something to do, sees his dad and his uncle, and they say, would you like to go on an adventure? And he says,
hell yeah. And let's get into it. This is the story of what happened to Marco Polo and why he's the name we remember and not Niccolo Polo. So we're back, and we are talking about Marco Polo in China. His first meeting with Kublai Khan. He is in Xanadu, which is, as we've mentioned, is not always the roller skating disco movie, but it is also the amazing palace complex to the northwest of Beijing. And Marco Polo's mind is blown, right? He's 21 years old, and you got to remember, he's from Venice, which is probably the richest town in Europe at the time that he is traveling here, right? He's from basically the New York City of Europe. He gets here and he cannot fathom the size and scale and opulence of the things that he's looking at. He says that Xanadu has 16 miles of walls that go around several palaces constructed entirely of marble. Kublai Khan appears to him pulled on a chariot. There's like an amazing throne that's on this pedestal, pulled by 4 elephants. He's got a zoo with all these exotic animals in it. He's got this huge hunting ground where you can hunt any kind of animal you want.
I was going to say, you said zoo, but please, we call it a menagerie.
Yeah, a menagerie. That's a better way of phrasing it. Yeah, Kublai Khan is there's deer in this hunting preserve on his property, and the way that Kublai Khan hunts them is by bringing cheetahs out on horseback and releasing them to go kill the deer for him. That's the level that we're talking about here.
Release the cheetahs.
Release the cheetahs to catch the deer, and that's how I hunt. I pointed the cheetah in the correct direction, and therefore I am an amazing hunter.
Yes.
And Marco Polo has been watching the traders come in and out of the biggest commercial hub in Europe, and he just cannot imagine what he's looking at. He's like, what is this, right? And Kublai Khan is very different from the rest of the Mongol kings and Khans and stuff. He is a little bit more cultured. He loves to hunt. He loves to fight. That's a very Mongol thing. He likes both of those things. But he also has kind of really adopted Chinese culture. He's really kind of adopted art and music and kind of being cool with other religions and other people and other ideas. And he kind of wants to accumulate.
He's just hey, tell me about Christianity because I'm curious.
Right, exactly, right? Hey, you guys...
Or Nestorian Christianity. Yeah.
Sure. He's down with it. He doesn't care. He's not Catholic. He's not Nestorian Christian.
Yeah.
He's Mongol religion leaning Buddhist, which is kind of the dominant Chinese religion at this time. But he's curious. He wants to know stuff. He's like, okay, well, you guys clearly have some money. You're dressed nice when you show up. You're bringing cool stuff that I like. Maybe we can set up trade between our two peoples. Maybe we can kind of grow and learn from each other. And he presents himself as this kind of, for lack of a better word, Renaissance man, because he is going to kind of help usher in the Renaissance, the capital R Renaissance in Europe. Him and Marco Polo together are going to do that.
Yeah.
But he is very different from anybody that Marco Polo has met. And just palaces on palaces, right? He's got his 15 wives or whatever, and each of them has a palace that would rival any palace for any king in Europe. And Marco Polo just cannot imagine this stuff when he's looking at it. And he's got a little bit of an in with Kublai Khan because Kublai Khan already likes Niccolo and Maffeo Polo. He's like,
hey, you're my guys who go on missions for me.
Yeah, and he's like, well, you kind of, I wanted 100 guys and you brought me one really good one, so maybe that's worth it. He brought the other stuff, we're negotiating here. We're doing some prime directive-y kind of stuff. We're building bonds between our people without war. That's awesome. And Marco Polo makes an impression on Kublai basically immediately. Marco Polo is very interesting because he's not what you would expect from a European explorer traveling to the Far East in the Middle Ages. He's on board with everything. He's like, I like silk. This feels awesome. I'll wear it. I'll try your food I've never had before. This looks great.
Yeah.
But also the spices thing that nobody's had cumin before, turmeric or whatever else goes into chicken tikka masala. So he's kind of on board with everything. And he runs this very interesting and very good diplomatic line between being he's cool and he's personable and he's friendly and he's nice and he gets along really well with Kublai Khan, and he doesn't do the thing that a lot of Europeans do at this time, which is be too hardcore about the religious thing, you got your religion, that's cool, you can do your thing, I'm not going to tell you how to live your life, and I'm not going to I don't know, try to chop your head off because you're Buddhist or whatever.
Yeah.
He dresses in the local clothes. He learns the language. He kind of integrates himself into the society in a way that I think a lot of Europeans wouldn't have at this time. And I think that there are some things in his writing that are a little bit problematic looking at it from 2022. But for 1270, this guy is he is along for the ride, and he is kind of going with it, and it's great. It's very refreshing. I was very happily surprised when I started reading some of the stuff that he wrote about this. It was definitely better than I was expecting, and he just kind of integrates himself and becomes friends with the Khan basically right away.
As one does.
Right. He's funny and he's smart,
Yeah.
but he's also smart enough to know when to not piss off the Mongols, because that is also an important thing that you need to kind of manage when you are more or less a prisoner of the Khan.
Note to self, do not piss off the Mongols.
Mm-hmm. When you are at the Mongol horde's mercy, you should just kind of try to swallow your pride every once in a while.
Roll with it.
And he's very good at it. He's good at it, and he does a good job of it. And he, even more than Niccolo and Maffeo, he kind of rises above them even, and to become a favorite of Kublai Khan. So for the next 17 years, Marco Polo remains in China. He is an emissary. He's a diplomatic emissary. He goes on diplomatic missions. He translates documents. He does some trading stuff. He even serves as the Khan's representative, administrative representative over the city of Yangzhou for a while. He does whatever the Khan needs him to do.
Okay, so he's an outsider, he's a foreigner, and he somehow manages to find a place in the civil service, or?
Yeah, and it works well for Kublai because Kublai Khan is also an outsider. He's a Mongol administering over Han Chinese. And so he relates to Marco Polo in some way. They find this common ground on we're both kind of running the show here, but neither of us are from here. We're both kind of out of our depth. And there's a lot of people here who wish we weren't here. So you're able to kind of find some common ground there. And Marco Polo starts going on travels all over Asia. He goes to Japan. He goes to Indonesia, Sri Lanka, Vietnam. He goes to some of the islands. He goes to India. He's traveling all over the place, and he sees all kinds of crazy stuff, right? Ivory palaces, gold, silver, jewels, fine silks. He's eating the best foods and the spices. He's getting all of the stuff that he's sharing dinner with the Khan, right? Diamonds.
I'm getting hungry.
Yeah, he's there's diamonds, and then there's scarves from Kashmir, there's ivory, there's these huge sprawling fortresses and cities and palaces all over the empire that he is just amazed by, right? Things that cities that dwarf anything that is known to the Europeans at the time, right? And like I keep saying, he's from one of the more cosmopolitan areas of Europe, but when he gets to China, he's just dude, you have no idea.
Yeah, Venice is the shit.
It's amazing. I was there last summer and my mind was blown, but his mind was blown just as hard.
Venice had its own empire.
Yeah.
But
yeah. It spanned most of the Adriatic, right?
Yeah.
Golden pagodas in Burma. And he goes to Hangzhou, which has this huge lake in the middle of it that's beautiful. It's got millions of inhabitants, which is mind-blowing for him at the time, right? Venice had one main square and Hangzhou has 10. And each one of them is a half mile by a half mile.
Oh, wow.
And it's Kublai Khan, the way he describes it and the way that he always referred to China was that the difference between China and Europe is that Kublai Khan counts his money and his people and his scale in the millions, which nobody in Europe was doing at the time.
Wow.
Right?
Yeah.
Marco Polo gets a nickname later in his life, Marco Millions, because that's all he talks about is how he...
Il Milione.
Yeah, Il Milione, yeah. How he talks about how Kublai measured things in millions, and he talks about it so much that he becomes known as Marco Millions.
Marco Millions. That sounds like a rapper name.
Oh, for me, I was thinking Mob Guy.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Hey, I'm Marco Millions.
Yeah.
He sees some dangerous stuff, right?
Uh-huh.
He encounters cannibals in Sumatra. He encounters bandits and pirates. There's a group in Myanmar that would kill travelers and cut them up because they wanted to steal their souls.
Ooh, that's harsh.
And Marco Millions goes there on a mission from the Khan to tell them to stop doing that.
Okay, how does this go? Does Marco succeed in telling them to stop cutting up people, or does Marco himself get cut up into pieces?
They do not cut him up and turn him into pieces. When presumably when you are the mouth of Kublai Khan, you're prevented from that particular superstition or whatever.
Okay, that might give you some cred. Yeah.
He sees unimaginable works of construction and jungle, like stuff that you don't have in Europe, right? Even just going into a jungle would be mind-blowing for a European.
Yeah, like if you're from Venice, there's like deeply cool shit in Venice. And you're just like, whoa.
It's heavily forested, right? That's how they built the whole city. They just sunk logs in the lagoon and built a city on top of it.
Yeah,
but
that was like before, and like the trees are now substructure.
Yeah.
And then you're Marco Polo and you're like, oh wow, I'm in the jungle.
You're in a rainforest, which like, could you imagine being dropped into Vietnam from like France? It's a foreign country. It's science fiction, right?
Yeah.
And he's seen all these animals he's never seen before, right? Camels, horses. He rides on camels, horses, and elephants. Just on his way to China, he rides camels, horses, and elephants.
Yeah.
When he's there, he's seeing lions, tigers, elephants. He sees what he calls unicorns, which we think are probably rhinos. One horn, big 4 legs, one horn. He just mentions them in passing. He's like, yeah, if you like unicorns, they got unicorns here. But we think he's probably talking about rhinos.
Okay. So he mentions these in passing.
In passing.
So he sees a creature that he believes is a unicorn, or he might be a unicorn, and that's not the most important thing that he's talking about.
He was more focused on the dudes that were going to kill him and eat his soul than he was on the rhinos, I think.
Okay,
I saw some unicorns, it's fine.
Yeah, fair point. Okay, like, oh, wow, mythical creature. Okay, dude, okay, no, don't kill me. Don't kill me.
He sees guys off the coast of Singapore that are called shark charmers that like keep the sharks away from the fishermen. He hunts wolves. He uses eagles to hunt wolves, and he uses cheetahs to hunt deer.
Wait, he uses eagles? That's like a Mongol thing, right?
Totally a Mongol thing, right? The Mongols love to fight and hunt. And Kublai Khan, no matter how cultured he is, how advanced he is among the Mongol people, he has still got that Mongol heart, and he likes to kill things, and he hunts the golden eagles that like kill wolves. But
like the thing about the like hunting with eagles, that's a thing even to today.
Yeah. So he goes and does that. He does the cheetah hunting thing, which I don't think is a deal anymore. I don't think they have cheetahs in Asia anymore. But I mean, it's Animal Planet stuff, right? But it's also science fiction. It's like a D&D adventure, right? Where he's seeing all these crazy monsters, the man-eating creatures. He's in Sumatra, he sees tigers, right? Like, they don't have any of this stuff where he came from.
Yeah.
And it's blowing his mind, but he's doing this. And then he works his way up. I mean, 17 years is a long time. He's doing all of these things while he's there. He eventually gets promoted up to, as the Mongols are, when you get promoted high enough, you suddenly start taking on military details, right?
As one does.
Right. So he starts marching with the Mongol army on missions to like quell bandits or expand the empire or do various Mongol related things. So he is marching at the head of an army of 200,000 mounted Mongols. And I want to put this in perspective.
Yeah, the 200,000 mounted Mongols. So this is 200,000 human beings on 200,000 horses?
They usually would carry 3 horses.
Oy.
So this is the point I want to make. And this is a point that I think is very important when understanding Marco Polo that we need to talk about, which is the scale of what he is experiencing is not on the level of anything anybody in Europe could comprehend.
Yeah.
So let's look for reference. Let's look at the big battle that created England as we know it today, right? The Battle of Hastings, 1066. It's 200 years before this, but time progresses. Yeah. Everybody's still riding on horseback and shooting bow and arrows and fighting with swords, right?
Yeah.
It's 200 years, but like not a lot has changed technologically. William the Conqueror had stirrups, but that's, that was like the technological advancement over the Romans.
Yeah.
And so Battle of Hastings, William the Conqueror goes and he fights and he defeats the Saxons and he takes over England. We don't know for sure, but best estimate, 20,000 soldiers total among both sides combined. Marco Polo is riding at the head of an army that is 10 times the size of that entire battlefield.
Wow.
It's something that we need to think about while we talk about him because, one thing that is kind of a challenge when talking about Marco Polo is that, like, we've seen pictures of all of this stuff that he's talking about. And you can go to a zoo and see a rhino now. And 250,000 guys is smaller than the current U.S. Army. But compared to what was going on in Europe in 1200, this is out of control.
Yeah, and also just in like actual human terms, like as a human being on the ground, how big is 200,000?
Could you imagine the sound of 200,000 horses riding by you? Like, it would take an hour for them to all ride past you, right? Maybe longer.
Yeah, and how does an actual human being conceptualize 200,000? Like, if one goes to a football stadium.
Depends on the stadium, but you're looking at 60 maybe?
Yeah.
3 football stadiums worth of people? And that would be like NFL stadiums, not like high school football stadiums, unless you're in Texas, right?
Oh, yeah.
Marco's there for some pretty big battles. So he's going into, I mean, he travels everywhere, right? So he's going through jungle. He's passing through ancient ruins of old, like, Khmer and old Viet, like, ruins in the jungle, right?
Yeah.
He's going through the Gobi Desert. There's old ruins, there's current stuff. He's fighting in the desert, he's fighting in the jungle. He's traveling everywhere over these 17 years. He gets sent everywhere that he can possibly go, and he's leading these armies. And he starts to get a little bit disillusioned by what's going on. So he likes all of this opulence and the spices. He loves the food, he loves the language, he loves the culture, he loves the dress and all of this stuff. He doesn't love the slaughtering of the women and children. He doesn't love the, like, launching catapults at buildings and killing people and beheading all of the surviving men and the real, like, nitty-gritty Mongol stuff that the Mongols are still doing at this time period. This kind of, like I said, Kublai Khan likes to hunt and he likes to fight and he likes to wage war and he likes to, you know, subject his enemies to his wrath. But for Marco Polo, this doesn't fit the idea of Kublai Khan that he had, of this kind of cultured Renaissance man when he's standing on this field watching the Mongol army, like, behead prisoners of war and women and children. He doesn't like it. And he's like, oh, maybe actually this guy's not as awesome as I thought he was.
Yeah.
And he starts to get a little bit sad once he gets into this level of power where he's marching with the army. Like, it was really fun when we all dressed up and marched in a parade, but it's less fun now that I'm standing on this blood-soaked sand with people screaming for their families, you know.
Made. Okay, yeah, no, I say he gets to see the sausage being made, but it's like, no, it's like he gets to see humans being decapitated.
The sausage being made is like a great example, right? Like, that's how these people are being treated, right? Like, how like these Mongol lieutenants dealt with their prisoners, right? Like, and it's brutal and it's awful, and it's, you know, it's one thing to be like drive your enemies before you and hear the lamentations of their women, but it's a very different thing to, I mean, that's a Genghis Khan quote. I should stipulate that, you know.
To actually hear the lamentations?
It's very different to be standing there watching that happen, you know?
Yeah.
Because it takes hours, you know? And it's not like...
Okay, it takes hours, and also it's, like, horrific.
Right, exactly. You're just standing there watching, like, a horror movie for hours, right? Like, brutal stuff. And he did not like it. He was not a fan of this. So that starts to disillusion him. And the other thing that he's thinking at this point is that, like, he's been there 17 years. Kublai Khan, he was 21 when he got there, but Kublai Khan was older. Kublai Khan's old now, right? Kublai Khan doesn't have much longer to live. And, you know, when you're Marco Polo and you work your way in close with the Khan of the Mongol horde, you don't do that without making a few enemies in court who are also Mongol warriors who may succeed Kublai Khan as the Khan. And Marco Polo and Niccolo and Maffeo, his dad and his uncle, were like, we got to get out of here before Kublai dies. Because when Kublai dies, we're done for, right? Like, we're going to be on the first wave of purges for whoever replaces him. So we got to go. So they go to Kublai and they're like, we got to go. And Kublai's like, no, you're too valuable. You can't leave.
Uh-oh.
So they have to ask him like 5 or 6 times. It takes them a couple years before he finally lets them go.
Oy.
So he does eventually let them go in 1291. He gives them the mission to escort his daughter, the Princess Kokochin. She's going to go to Persia to seal a marriage alliance with the Ilkhanate. So it's not Hulagu Khan anymore, but it's that part of that section of the horde. So this is probably incestuous in some way, to some degree, but Kublai Khan's daughter is going to go marry Hulagu Khan's nephew or whatever, you know.
But maybe this is like baseline, you know.
Yeah, it's not full Valyrian, but it's a little Habsburgian, I guess. And I guess, like, this is just sort of what happens among royal houses. Yeah, that's how you get Rasputin. You get everybody having hemophilia, and that's how you end up with Rasputin.
Okay. Okay.
So they are going to go by sea, which is a kind of a new thing for Marco Polo. He's sailed to a bunch of the islands and stuff, but this is the farthest he's going to have traveled by sea.
So we're in the 13th century, and so sea routes from China, maybe not completely established, or
No, lots of pirates happening here. It's dangerous. He's traveling with the princess of the Mongol Empire, so he's not too worried about it. He's got a pretty big bodyguard entourage around him.
Okay, good for him.
And so they go to Singapore, they go to Sumatra, they go to India, and then from India they go by land through Persia, drop off the princess, no problems, continue on towards the Black Sea, and eventually decide they're going to sail for home. They don't want to go back because there's too many enemies for them in China. And after 24 years and maybe somewhere between 15 and 20,000 miles.
Oh, wow.
Marco Polo finally returns to Venice.
And what's Venice like when he gets back?
He returns home to Venice, and he didn't have much there, right? He had his uncle and his aunt that raised him, but he didn't have much to go home to. He didn't have a wife and kids or anything like that there. He goes back, and Venice is at war with the Italian city of Genoa. You have all these Italian city-states at the time. So Genoa and Venice are at war. So Marco Polo's like, well, okay, I'll fight to defend Venice. He comes back. He's incredibly wealthy. He's got all of these treasures and all of these things he brought back from China with him. But he also feels this responsibility to his hometown against the Genoans. And he feels loyalty to Venice, so he goes to fight for them. He buys a boat, and he buys a trebuchet, and he puts the trebuchet on his boat, and he goes to fight the Genoans.
Okay. He has a boat, and he puts the trebuchet on the boat.
Yes.
That's awesome.
Yeah. And he commands it, and he hires a crew, and he commands it in battle for Venice against Genoa. And he's defeated.
No!
Yes.
Oh.
He is involved
Even with a trebuchet on a boat?
With the trebuchet on a boat. He is defeated somewhere off the coast of Turkey, possibly at the Battle of Curzola, which is a huge battle that happened around this time period. Venice was this up-and-coming, very powerful trade empire. Genoa was arguing with them. There was a huge battle that took place around this time, and something like 100 Venetian galleys on one side, 80 Genoan on the other. Huge losses, huge destruction, lots of death. Nothing like he'd seen with the Mongols, but lots of death and destruction and dying. And Marco Polo and the Venetians are crushed, right? And there was a chance that this type might break the Venetian Republic. They recover, but this was really, really dark moment for Venice's history. Yeah. So Marco Polo is defeated. He surrenders. His ship is bashed up. A lot of his crew are dead. The Venetian fleet is mostly destroyed. He is put in shackles, and his ship is towed from the waters off the coast of Adana, Turkey, to Genoa. And he is imprisoned in a tower in Genoa, overlooking the sea there. And he is kind of just thrown into this tower and locked up.
Oh, no. So our boy's in the slammer.
He's in the slammer.
For
4 years. He's imprisoned for 4 years by the Genoans.
Yeah. His
cellmate is another person who had been captured by the Genoans. His cellmate in the tower is a dude named Rusticello, which I don't know if the CH is a hard CH or a soft CH.
It's a hard C, yeah.
Okay, Rusticello. Yeah. Rusticello? Okay.
Rusticello, yeah.
Rusticello da Pisa. He was a dude from Pisa who the Genoans had overtaken that, and they took this guy and they imprisoned him in the tower. Rusticello da Pisa is the first Italian person to write about King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table in Italy. He was a famous author who had written King Arthur stories for the people of Italy. He wrote in French and he wrote in Italian. He was a best-selling author who had been kind of imprisoned and thrown in this tower, and he is Marco Polo's cellmate. And here is a thing that is 100% worth mentioning when talking about Marco Polo, is that he had no intention of telling anybody about what he had done in China until he was locked in a tower with this best-selling fiction writer for 4 years.
So it's like if in some alternate timeline, I go out and have adventures, and then somehow I wind up being locked in a cell with Stephen King or something.
Right. And you have nothing to do except talk about your lives.
Yeah.
And Marco Polo is just well, yeah, I was in China for a while. And Rusticello is okay, what'd you do there?
Gets a pen.
And then over the course of this 4 years, they write Marco Polo's memoirs, which he had no intention of doing, which I love. And I feel like I cannot stress enough that he had no plans to write any of this down.
Or at least that's what he said.
Right.
That's the shtick that's the persona that I don't know.
I believe it's accurate because when you read this stuff that he wrote, he is a business guy. He's a finance guy. It's very clear that he was very personable in real life, but when he the way he thinks about things is like, then it had 12 gates and it had 47 bridges, and then we ate this and it was made out of it had this much weight of marble on it, and blah blah blah. He's just like, he's a bean counter, and he writes like a bean counter. But Rustichello is like, I think I can spice this up a little bit.
Spice.
Oh yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
And over the course of 4 years, they write this story of Marco Polo's adventures in China. And in 1299, the war between Genoa and Venice ends, and they're released, and they go to publish it. And Marco Polo wants to call the book Description of the World, which is a very Marco Polo thing that he would want to do. That's what he would want to call it. Rustichello decides he wants to call it The Great Book of Marvels of the World, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
The Italians know it as the Millions.
Il Milione, yeah.
Because that was Marco's nickname later on in life, and that's what they call the book, is the Millions. In English, we just call it The Travels of Marco Polo, but whatever the names, this blew everyone's minds. And it's what you said, it's written in an illuminated manuscript by a professional, by a best-selling romance author. This is the movie adaptation of Marco Polo's life, written like with the author's help by a dude who is like good at this stuff, right?
Yeah.
And so when it comes out, between the animal stuff and the travels and all of the, like, so everything that comes out, this is like reading a sci-fi story, right? It's like reading Gulliver's Travels, right?
Yeah.
Right, for the later generation, right? Like, people are like, what? There's no way this exists in real life. And that's one thing I love about it. Everybody on the time period was like, this is bullshit. You're full of shit, right? Like, there's no way this has happened.
Like, this is comic book.
No way, you're totally lying.
This is made up. This is fantasy.
Right. And even today, when we can Google image search some of this stuff, like there's people who are like, no, he was lying because it said that Xanadu had 27 gates, but we know from the schematics that it actually had 25. So he's totally exaggerating. He probably didn't even go there. And it's like, okay, look, he is writing about things that he remembered from 17 years before, and it's being filtered through
another dude,
a best-selling fiction novelist.
Yeah.
And the original manuscript of this was written in a language called Franco-Venetian, which was then translated into all these other languages, and things got lost in translation. And also the other translators interpreted their own stuff. So entire passages appear in various translations of this book that don't appear in the original.
Yeah. And honestly, going specifically to like, does it have 25 gates or 27 gates? When you're talking about manuscripts, numbers are like the most likely to get messed up because they're just so arbitrary, you know?
I don't remember how old I am like half the time.
Same. Yeah.
I can't remember.
Yeah.
I'm definitely not going to, like, if you ask me how many windows there are on the front of my house, I don't think I could tell you accurately. Yeah. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
like,
exactly. Yeah.
And Marco Polo, like, is right about a lot of this stuff because he does remember these things because he is a bean counter.
Yes.
So he is right about a lot of this stuff. But like, they're like, he didn't even mention the Great Wall of China. And it's like, he probably didn't go there.
Yeah. or like, also, sometimes you don't mention the things that are just so friggin' obvious.
Sure. He just didn't come up. We didn't think of it. He didn't write it down. Rustichello didn't think it was interesting.
Yeah.
So Marco Polo gets a lot of credit for like, oh, he, introduced the West to China, or like he brought spaghetti back, which people think like there's a long-standing urban legend that like when he came back, he brought lo mein with him, and that became spaghetti. Like this is old, right? The Silk Road has existed forever. None of this stuff none of the things that he brought back were like the first time anybody had ever seen this thing. His contribution to Western civilization is that he wrote like the first like travel book on what's up in the East right now.
Yeah.
And people were like, dude, this is awesome. I want to go there. And that inspired an entire future generation of explorers, which became the age of discovery of like, how can we build a boat that will sail us there faster? How can we get here that doesn't involve walking through sandstorms or like riding on a camel through the Gobi Desert?
But this is how Europeans got their like stuff together to go discover the Americas.
Right, exactly. Like they were kind of insulated in, a lot of the stuff that was written in this time period is religious related, religious texts, things like that, right? Maybe there were people in Venice who wanted to go visit the Holy Land, but, the realm of Kublai Khan was not Yuan dynasty China was not a very high priority on like the wish list for life travel, right? It wasn't on a lot of people's bucket lists to see Xanadu until Marco Polo got back and was like, actually, this is like the most awesome thing I've ever seen in my entire life. And the way he wrote about it and the way he described it. And so he kind of blows everybody's mind with this. And like, it helps. He provides some contribution for like some early cartography. He brought maps back with him, which helped the Western world kind of create maps. It's kind of how we located where Japan is and some of the Southeast Asian islands that Marco Polo had visited. They weren't on any European maps. And there's a lot of contribution that he provides to the West that way. He also one thing I had talked about him not being like a super religious kind of hardliner.
Yeah, like he was open to other things.
Right. And so he recorded other things, right? Like I think if those Dominican monks had gone with him and had the same adventure as him and come back, they wouldn't have described the intricate details of the Buddhist religion, right? Or the culture or the language or the characters that they use. They don't use the alphabet, they use characters, right? There's all of these, the kind of dress they wore and the way they spoke. And they're things that Marco Polo notes that maybe are a little bit more cultural and maybe wouldn't have been mentioned by somebody who was like, oh, this is all heresy, right? Or this is all idolatry or whatever. And so, I think he should get some credit for that. And his discovery has kind of helped to kind of spark not just the Renaissance in Italy, but also this age of discovery, age of exploration. Like all of these guys, the Vasco da Gamas and the Columbuses and the Magellans, they've read Marco Polo's book and were like, if not just the lure of the amazingness of this realm and I want to see it, but hey, there's probably some money to be made here if we could get out there, right? Like
also true.
Right. Even from a purely like cynical point of view, like, hey,
exploitative.
Right. If I can get out there and trade for some of this tea, like maybe I can make some money. Right.
Yeah. Oh, tea.
And so that was his contribution, was the book that he wrote that he didn't mean to write. From adventures that he had that he didn't grow up thinking he was going to have. He becomes this celebrity across the Western world. He's rich and famous. He's 45 when he gets out of jail, and then he finally he gets married for the first time. He gets married. He has 3 daughters. He's wealthy. He's famous. He's a powerful Venetian merchant.
Good on him.
And he lives to be an old man and never goes back to China because I think probably
China's kind of a schlep.
It's a bit of a hike for him, and also there's a lot of people there that probably don't like him.
Oh yeah.
Probably made some enemies who are going to be a little jealous of him being good friends with Kublai Khan.
Yeah.
And he dies an old man in bed in June of 1324. His last words were, "I have not told half of what I have seen."
Oh, Marco, you're holding out on us.
Yeah, I love him. He's just kind of this everyman who goes on this crazy adventure. And then
very open-minded everyman.
Yeah, which I think is awesome.
Yeah.
If you'd like to read any more about Marco Polo, I really encourage you to read his book. In English, it's called The Travels of Marco Polo. It's very good, and it gives you a really good insight into the guy that I think he might surprise you. It surprised me in a really good way. So, he's very dry. He's a lot of nuts and bolts and numbers and long descriptions of things that you're like, get to the point, Marco. But it's worth reading because it's his own words, and he dictated it himself, and it's only filtered through a few people who were trying to make it marketable. I also really enjoyed, I read Marco Polo by Milton Rugoff, and there's a book called Marco Polo From Venice to Xanadu by Lawrence Bergreen, which are both worth checking out, if nothing else than because they kind of fact-check the Travels of Marco Polo, his autobiography. So you can check those out, and I encourage you to do so if you want to learn more about this guy. So Anyway, that's our show for today, and thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you next week.
Badass of the Week is an iHeartRadio podcast produced by High Five Content. Executive producers are Andrew Jacobs, me, Pat Larash, and my co-host, Ben Thompson. Writing is by me and Ben. Story editing is by Ian Jacobs, Brandon Phibbs, and Allie Lamer. Mixing and music and sound design is by Jude Brewer. Consulting by Michael May. Special thanks to Noel Brown at iHeart. Badass of the Week is based on the website badassoftheweek.com, where you can read all sorts of stories about other badasses. If you want to reach out with questions, ideas, you can email us at badasspodcast@badassoftheweek.com. If you like the podcast, subscribe, follow, listen, and tell your friends and your enemies if you want, as we'll be back next week with another one. For more podcasts from iHeartRadio, visit the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.